The sixth deadly sin is named by the church acedia, or sloth. In the world, it calls itself tolerance, but in hell, it's called despair. It is the accomplice of the other sins and their worst punishment. It is the sin that believes in nothing, cares for nothing, seeks to know nothing, interferes with nothing, enjoys nothing, loves nothing, hates nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, and remains alive only because there is nothing it would die for. We have known it far too well for many years. The only thing, perhaps, that we have not known about it is that it is a mortal sin. Those are the words from Dorothy Sayers, a playwright and author who lived in the early 20th century. It's from her series of letters to the church, later published in a book entitled Letters to a Diminished Church. We're in a summer series this morning exploring the many themes of wisdom in the book of Proverbs. We've looked together at the value of wisdom. We've looked and considered reproof. We have looked last week at making wise plans. And this morning we're going to consider the sluggard in Proverbs. The sluggard in Proverbs. By exposing the root of sloth as deep-seated apathy for anything, including God, Dorothy Sayers helpfully cuts right to the heart of the sluggard. And so the question our text asks of us this morning is punctuated so well by Dorothy is, am I lazy? Are you lazy? Now, before we just bristle up at that question, because it's not a very good question to be asked, it would be to our benefit to remember that we've learned thus far in Proverbs, namely that the humble will receive wisdom. God offers wisdom to us in His Word, and the humble are ready to receive it. We're going to be in Proverbs chapter 24. We'll be in verses 30 through 34 this morning, so if you would turn in your own copy of Scripture there. And while you are, let's shed some light on a little bit of the context of Proverbs chapter 24. It fits in a section at the end of the book of Proverbs, and that section is entitled with verse 23. You can see there on verse 23, it starts with, "These are also the sayings of the wise." And it ends in chapter 25. You can see the header of chapter 25 also then says, "These also are the Proverbs of Solomon," which the men of Hezekiah, king of Judah, copied. And so it's likely that these Proverbs in the end of chapter 24 are written by someone other than Solomon. We don't know the name precisely, but it would have been wise sages, a collection of sayings under the leadership and the tutelage of Solomon. But it still is under the main heading of the book of Proverbs, and I don't want us to miss that, which shows us that this is Solomon's wisdom, God's wisdom through Solomon for his son. As he imparts wisdom on his family, these are his words to him. And so the picture in play is one of the sage here in chapter 24, recounting an experience to his son or his family. It's as if he's passed by this house on the way home, and he's seized the opportunity to recount the wisdom of which he gleaned from this experience. And so he's sitting around the dinner table. You can picture it like this. He's sitting around the dinner table, possibly, and he's sharing what he saw on the way home, sharing the wisdom that he gleaned to his sons and daughters around the table. And I think that's the picture we want to see, a loving father imparting wisdom, a loving parent imparting wisdom, and that's how we then approach Proverbs 24. Let's start with Proverbs 24. Follow along with me, starting in verse 30. "I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns. The ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. And then I saw and considered it. I looked and received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man." The main idea of this text that I want us to see for this morning, God's big idea for us this morning, would be something like this. Wake up to God's wisdom about the sluggard. Wake up and see, or lay hold of, or grab hold of God's wisdom to the sluggard. We're going to see this unfold for us in this text this morning under 3 points. The first point is the warning for the sluggard. The warning for the sluggard. That's going to be captured in verses 30 through 31. Next, after the warning, we'll see the ways of the sluggard. The ways of the sluggard in verses 32 through 34. And then we'll finish considering the hope for the sluggard. The hope for the sluggard. So the warning for the sluggard, the ways of the sluggard, and the hope for the sluggard. Proverbs describes this lazy person as the sluggard. The sluggard is all over Proverbs. It's not necessarily a term we use, right, frequently today, but behind the word for sluggard it's a verb, and it means to hesitate, to be stopped. It's the idea of hesitation when action is needed, idleness when movement is required. Like cold syrup on the bottom of a syrup bottle that takes its sweet little time, oozing from the bottom all the way to the top onto my waffle, no matter how much encouragement I'm going to give it. This is the idea of the sluggard. The word captures this sort of infuriating sluggishness. The sluggard is a person of habitual laziness. It's a person of inaction with an aversion to discomfort, an aversion to exertion or a timeline. Nah, I just don't want to do it right now. That's the thought of the sluggard. And this kind of person doesn't like objective, definitive questions like when will that get done, and how, and on what timeline, when's it going to start? Those questions are not appreciated. Well, over and over again, Solomon and the other sages return to address this person. In fact, they see this topic of laziness as so important that it's sprinkled evenly 23 times from the front of Proverbs to the back of Proverbs. Some different 23 times these Proverbs exist in the book, and they directly address idleness and diligence. There are many major themes of Proverbs, to be sure, but the sluggard is definitely the foremost, one of the foremost and most consistent. It's as if Solomon and the other sages return to this topic continually to ring the warning bell for us. We read it and then we move away and we come back and need another ringing of the warning bell against the folly of laziness. And if we're diligent, we should ask the question, why? What is so important here for us to glean? Why does he return over and over again to this topic for his sons? Why is it so important for Solomon to teach his son about the sluggard? When he sits down to impart this wisdom, why is it so prominent? Well, I think the answer lies in our text this morning. It's at least hidden there. There are two reasons that I would like to give you on why I think Solomon returns over and over again to the sluggard in Proverbs. First is because the way toward laziness is slippery. It's slippery. And its end is disastrous. The road to disaster is slippery and subtle. And Solomon catches that, and so he returns to ring the bell of warning to us so that we don't miss it as it goes on by. It's one thing for us to have something so destructive that it's right in front of us so that we can avoid it. Like a train barreling down upon you, you see it, it's objective, and it's like, I know I need to step aside. If I don't, it's immediate death. Or like a cliff you see coming from a long ways off, right? You can stop, or you can turn around, or you can run the other direction. I'm not going there. I'm going to turn this way. But laziness is slippery and sneaky, isn't it? It creeps on us inch by inch. Instead, like an ever-increasing slope of a hill, you begin walking down it, not sensing the increasing steepness until you wake up to a near vertical fall of disaster. And so Solomon says, something this stealthy and slippery that leads to such destruction needs a solid wake-up call. That's our warning to us this morning. Well, Solomon pulls no punches, does he? It's just a disclaimer on the front end. I think it's helpful for us to recognize this particular proverb, especially of the other proverbs in the book, is going to land on us a little bit differently. Each one of us is going to take this a little bit differently. For some of us, this is exactly the word we need to hear this morning. It's the shoe fits, if it will. For others, this might be more of a nuanced or difficult to see exactly where we tend towards in our hearts, towards the sluggard or towards laziness. But again, for all of us, I think our prayer is to receive humbly. the wisdom that God has for us here. And so we observe his field in verses 30. Look again at verse 30. I passed by the field of the sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns, and the ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. We observe this field, and we see the result of this person. And it's interesting that as we pass by this field, it isn't just a passing remark. It isn't just a, that's interesting. I don't know what's happening there. That's just an interesting thing to see. I'm just moving on. No, the sage grabs our attention with that word, behold. Let me read it again. I passed by the field of a sluggard, by the vineyard of a man lacking sense, and behold, it was all overgrown with thorns, and the ground was covered with nettles, and its stone wall was broken down. Now, if you're familiar with the Bible at all, this word sometimes doesn't really land on us the way that we sometimes think it should. This is more of a, what? No way. Look at that. It's a jolting word that kind of grabs our attention. It's as if it's a modern-day equivalent of if you're driving in a car with a friend or with family and it's relatively quiet. It's not like in my van, but if it's relatively quiet and someone just shouts out of nowhere, look at that! That's amazing. What's happening over there? What in the world? And we all spin in that direction, right, for a moment just to catch the glimpse of something unexpected as it rapidly passed on by. This is the force of the word, and this is what the writer is trying to do for us this morning. It's supposed to be astonishing, what we see here. It's supposed to rock us a little bit of what we see at this field. So what is astonishing? We see thorns, we see weeds have moved in and taken over the place. The walls are crumbling and breaking down. But this decay is found not in the place you'd expect. You might expect that in a wilderness. You might expect that in a forest. But no, this is found in a place that was once productive. That's amazing. It's shocking because it just doesn't fit there. It's not supposed to be there, and something has gone horribly wrong. What's the tragedy here? Is the kind of force that we see in this text. We have the Olympics rapidly approaching on us, and this thought came to mind as well for us. If you've ever seen the pictures of some of the cities that have invested just billions of dollars, right, into the infrastructure of the Olympic Village and building up these intricate designs of buildings, these wonderful stadiums, grand stadiums for us to witness, just huge displays of the most elite athletes in the world pushing their bodies to the limits of humanity. It's meant to wow us, right? Well, some of those places have been kept just as they were, neglected, right? Maybe you've seen those pictures. It's a place that tells a story of record-breaking productivity and progress, and then a few weeks later, it's abandoned. Months later, structures are crumbling, the grass is dead, it's overgrown with weeds and trees, the building sits empty, thieves have looted the chairs and TVs off the walls. What's left of the pool contains this nasty concoction, if there's any water in it at all. There's banners falling all over the walls and ceilings. It's an amazing sight because you see through the neglect of this place and the abandonment and the inactivity, and it's a place once teeming with order. It's a place that once had immense productivity. So we have to, with this picture, we're left to ask, how did we get here? What happened? What happened here? Well, second thing to notice here is that the proverb is sort of flipped in its usual order. Did you notice that? Usually we get the cause and then the effect. This is what I'm doing, and then this is the result of what happens when I do this thing. But here we have the effect first and the result later. Did you notice that? It's an acting sort of as like an opening shock again to catch our attention. We're supposed to somewhat be taken back by this sight. Look at verse 34. We get the answer of what happened in verse 34. And poverty, it says, will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. See, the sage has given us the answer first. What's happened here? Poverty. Poverty has happened here. And what does poverty look like? The sluggard's field, the sluggard's vineyard. This is the picture of the sluggard's field in Proverbs. It's, again, just like the Olympic Village, it's a field of agriculture. It's supposed to be a place of life and sustainment. It's a place of industry. It's a place where a person's livelihood was. and is probably a place of work. What should we see here? We should see rows of plants ordered, right? Fruit growing and being cared for, workers moving up and down, tending and maintaining, the promise of a future harvest, and a crop to eat, to feed a family, to sell in the marketplace, not just for the family, but to produce good for the community around. A field more than likely passed down from generation to generation, probably one of the most valuable assets a generation can receive. But this field sits neglected, destroyed by time, destroyed by neglect. And it doesn't happen over the course of a few hours or days or even weeks. It happens over the course of a long time of neglect. Walls don't just crumble overnight. I'm ashamed to admit that my life in some way, or at least part of my life in some way, reflects this kind of live role-play action proverb that we have today. When we moved here in 2022, we got a house, by God's grace, just down the road. We had a small backyard that went straight up. It was a complete incline. It was almost unusable backyard. It was pretty much all forest. We had a retaining wall and a little place to have a patio. We moved in, though, in the end of August, right before school started. And this backyard, having lots of trees and ivy growing, it also had these immaculate steps going up and this stone path leading to a little fire pit and those kinds of things. It was a small, humble backyard, but it was full of trees and life and greenery. We moved in August, and between school starting and between work starting and between fall coming and all these other things happening, it just began to move into disarray. By December rolled around, I looked outside, and no kidding, I saw nettles about 5 or 6 feet high. And of the variant, I looked it up later, stinging nettles that if you actually touch it, it'll sting you and it'll leave an irritant on your hands. And these things shot up in the course of weeks. It became an eyesore. It became kind of a problem. And the kids couldn't even play outside in October or November. My thought at the time was, I'm busy. And winter's coming along, and winter in other places that I've experienced has a way of taking care of that problem. And so I thought, okay, we'll just see what happens in the spring. I'll take care of it in the spring. Well, to my dismay, these sorts of weeds don't just survive the cold, freezing temperatures, they actually multiply in it. And so I woke up in March, and it was much worse. And then I stared at it in complete despair. Because now I'm like, how much effort is required here to take care of said problem? Well, March turned into April. April turned into May. We found out we needed to move at the end of July. I had an impending deadline. I needed to clean up the backyard. I finally got outside. I got the tools required, and I started hacking away. Got a little bit of it cleaned up, and I moved to the backyard. I took 3 steps in to take care of one of these nettles and got stung by hornets 3 times immediately. I dropped the tools, and I was like, I'm done. I'm out. I'm not doing this anymore. This is the picture. To my dismay, I'm ashamed to say how much I had to pay for somebody else to come in and take care of that. The proverb here seems simple at first glance. My backyard seems simple at first glance, but lazy neglect of your life can lead to real and literal financial poverty. My backyard wasn't, but this proverb is in play, and it can lead to literal financial poverty. But is that the only poverty that Solomon's getting at here this morning? Look, it isn't lost on me that when I sit here and we're in this city and at this time, and laziness that produces this kind of proverbial level of poverty may not be your first concern. Y'all are some of the most driven, hardworking, and diligent people I know. And so squandering your work and this kind of poverty may not be the first issue. In fact, it could quite possibly be the other tendency. We might err on the other side of work, right? And this kind of poverty isn't a major concern for you. And note, I just want to note as a disclaimer, as we're thinking about poverty this morning in this proverb, the proverb is not saying that those in poverty are lazy. So I just want you to hear that this morning. Financial and economic poverty is much, much more complex than just that. And it's often the case that they're some of the hardest working people. So I'm not saying that, and I don't think the Proverbs is saying it, but it is saying, and I think it is helpful to hear, that habitual attitude of sluggard can lead to that financial poverty. But it could also be the case that while we may be inclined to diligence and discipline in our workplaces here in Washington, D.C., that we do so at the expense of riches elsewhere in our lives. Are there riches to be had elsewhere? A harvest to collect in other places of our lives, where, if we're honest, we're actually impoverished there? As an example, is it possible that a student with straight A's could exist, but you have neglected your spiritual walk and your time in the Word and prayer? Is it possible to be even successful at work, reaping the rewards of climbing the ladder rungs, one position to the next, but at home, the vineyard of your marriage is in shambles? You've neglected your soul in the Word and in prayer. Or is it possible that you're single, and you're a single person who is committed to the church, and you're even serving in this church? And you're all about the relationships here and discipleship, but at work, your productivity is average at best. You're just getting by. Or is it possible to be even an elder or a deacon or a volunteer in the church and have all these fantastic ministry opportunities on your calendar, a full calendar of discipleship, a full calendar of shepherding, of serving, but at home, your kids don't know their mom or their dad? You come home late, you leave early, running to the next discipleship meeting or the next breakfast. Or is it possible that you're all about the social events at church, that you're actually crowding out opportunities to serve in the church, in places that need help, to care for the widows in our church and the sick, those in the hospital, and those who are downtrodden? It may be that a literal poverty is danger for you here, but it's probably more likely that you resonate with one of those things I just mentioned, or one that I haven't. In other words, the danger for us here is that we read a text like this with some sort of selective hearing. Selective hearing. Maybe you can relate to that. When I was growing up, my dad was constantly the end of that joke. He had selective hearing. Now, it was a joke, and I love my dad. He's a wonderfully godly man. But the joke was there because just some things were just missed. But we all know what's happening there. Listen, they have a great marriage, but the point of the danger here is that sometimes as we approach Proverbs, we can have this sort of selective hearing to the diligence and idleness in yours and my life. We are quick to apply it to some of the easy areas, or the most evident, and slow to even see it in some of the others. I was helped this week by 3 areas for us to focus in on, and in applying diligence and laziness into our potential poverties. Your work life, number 1, your work life, your home life, number 2, and your spiritual life, number 3. Your work life, your home life, and your spiritual life. It could be that you are focusing in on one of them and missing the other 2. Or you're focusing on 2 and missing the 1. You're diligent at work, you're on time, you're a hard worker, you display a good work ethic, but the other areas of your life are impoverished. These opening verses give us a sobering wake-up call, doesn't they, to the destruction that awaits the sluggard in these areas of poverty. It serves as a gracious and kind warning to us. But that's not the full story, because the next question we need to ask is, how did we get here? How did we get to this level? Well, point 2, the ways of the sluggard. The ways of the sluggard. Picking back up in verse 32, follow along with me. Then I saw and I considered, I looked and I received instruction. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. So we've looked at the devastating results of laziness and the sort of poverties that could be awaiting you here. And the sage sees the destruction and then takes a lesson from it. He gleans this wisdom from what he sees in the world. He says, I saw, I considered, I looked, and I received. And so, to capture this wisdom with clarity, I want to give you 5 ways of the sluggard from Proverbs. 5 ways we want to see, we want to consider, we want to look, and we want to receive. These are 5 ways of the sluggard. We're going to use this particular text as kind of home base for these ways, and then we're going to branch out and capture what Proverbs as a whole is trying to teach us about laziness. And all of this with the goal towards answering the question of how did we get here. So number 1 of 5 ways of the sluggard. Number 1, the sluggard runs to sleep. He runs to sleep. Look again at verse 33. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. The sluggard loves sleep. He doesn't merely enjoy his sleep, he's addicted to it. We see that sleep and slumber and rest, it just rules his life. It rules his life one press of the snooze button at a time. Proverbs 26:14 has this kind of comical picture for us. It says, as a door turns on its hinges, so does a sluggard on his bed. Solomon's employing this vivid picture for us, that the comical way of describing this person who's on his bed, who's hinged to his bed. So as the door is hinged to the wall and can't go anywhere, the door's not moving, it's hinged there. So to the sluggard in the same way, it's hinged to his bed. He's not going anywhere. He's there in the morning, he's there in the afternoon. And as the door only has the capacity to produce one movement, open and close, so too the sluggard's only movement is to flippity-flop on the bed, on his hinges, just back and forth, making movement but no progress. Movement but no progress. Now, just by way of caveat, when we talk about the sluggard's overindulgence of sleep, there's a couple of things we're not saying. Just to be really clear, one of the things we're not saying is the different needs of sleep that God gives different people. Okay, so some of us can function just fine on 5 hours of sleep each night. I am not one of those, but God bless you. Others, like me, may need much, much more. It's not that one is more or less diligent than the other. In fact, you can have somebody who functions on little sleep be really lazy, and somebody who functions on a lot of sleep, right, be incredibly diligent. That's not the point. So this isn't saying it's a specific need of sleep, and if you don't have a specific amount of sleep, you're a sluggard. It's also not saying, what else is also not in play here is the very real difficulty of battling certain things like depression. Okay, so I just want to be really honest and open about that. Like, there are people in this room who are battling severe depression, severe depressive struggles that make rhythms of sleep and work incredibly hard. Some of you have real difficulties and firsthand experiences in things like insomnia that make it almost impossible to get out of bed, or you just get sleep whenever you can, because you don't know when the next one's going to be. This is not what this is talking about here, okay? Also, lastly, this is also not talking about seasons of life. Some of them are just more exhausting than others. Caring for a sick family member or a friend, seasons of sprinting at work, or the newborn stage, difficulty in family situations that just drain you physically and emotionally and you need some rest, all these and others, these are exhausting seasons that require you to simplify life and to rest and to sleep. And Proverbs is not getting at that, so we don't want you to walk away from that. So these are real situations. Proverbs doesn't prescribe for every person the perfect number of hours of sleep, but what is in play here is that it's simply not that the sluggard can't, it's that he won't. It's not that the sluggard can't. He chooses not to. He won't get going because I just love my sleep too much. I just love my slumber. Rest always wins. It's actually no longer a humorous proverb if you think about it from that vantage point. He's hinged to his bed, he's tied to his easy chair, and he's fixed to the couch with a love of his comfort. And he has an aversion to exertion. For the sluggard, the discomfort of diligence disgusts his heart. You can see when the sluggard fails to understand certain rhythms of rest and work that come together that God has created, we see that rest and sleep in God's word is not wrong. It's necessary for life. It's a gift from God. Rest is a sweet thing for the diligent and the hardworking. Solomon, again, in Ecclesiastes 5:12, he says, "Sweet is the sleep of a laborer, whether he eats little or much." See, there's real fulfillment and enjoyment that comes with rest after a diligent day. There's certain satisfaction that is there when the time for rest is now, because work instead of sleep was done then. God says 6 days you are to labor. 6 days you are to work, but the seventh is a day of Sabbath. It's a day of rest. You see these cycles and these rhythms that God puts in place of rest and work. But for the sluggard, the temptation in sleep is to distort and twist these patterns and seasons to maximize his rest, his comfort, his inaction, and his sleep. He's sleeping when there should be action. Indeed, Proverbs 13:4, the soul of the sluggard craves and gets nothing, while the soul of the diligent is richly rewarded. So number one, first, the sluggard runs to sleep. That's number 1 of 5. Number 2, the sluggard resists with procrastination. The sluggard resists with procrastination. Look again at verse 33. It's a little sleep. It's a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. The sluggard procrastinates. He puts things off. And this text teaches us that the sluggard reaches his poverty. He destroys his field. He destroys his vineyard by his decisions of procrastination made in the little moments of life. It's not the big moments. It's just a little more, a little more, a little more. For the sluggard, it isn't actually that he outright refuses to work. Did you ever notice that? It's not that he's actually against work. He doesn't refuse to necessarily. Instead, he just puts it off moment by moment and little by little and inch by inch, deceiving himself and others around him that he'll actually get it done. But that's exactly the problem. There's always just a little more. There's always a little more to activity, a time of activity, and the work never actually arrives. Or if it does arrive, it's too late, and the consequences of verse 34 come crashing down. This is the danger that it requires us to be intentional and thoughtful about this in our hearts. All of this was lost in the small moments of concession. All of it was forfeited just inch by inch. This is the slipperiness. One small concession followed by another. Concessions and moments build to days, days to weeks, and weeks to months, until the opportunity for a sluggard just slips away from him. It's easy for us to look at the big stuff and the big dangers of life. But it's the danger of the littles that can lead to the poverties of life. This is the danger, and this is what we have to be aware of. In what small concessions of littles of my life am I making? What ways am I saying just a little more sleep? In what ways am I saying just one more scroll, one more glance on social media, just one more show, just one more page of my book, just one more click, and then I'll get up and get to it? Or in the realm of our relationships, we put off those hard conversations until it's a more convenient time. I don't want to get there right now. I don't want to do that. Or we convince ourselves we'll start pursuing and loving our spouse better at a later time when work gets a little bit easier. I know my marriage is in a rough spot, but we'll address it, just not right now. Or I know we need to address that parenting issue, but we'll get to that later. I know I need to spend time with my children. I'll get around to it. I know I need to confess that sin to him or to her. Not right now. I'm tired. I'll mend that friendship later, until little by little, opportunities slip through and they're gone. We can also see this in the realm of our spiritual life and holiness with the little by littles. Just one more glance, just one more website, just one more day before I ask for help. One more day gone by with my Bible left unopened, collecting dust. I know prayer is lacking in my life. I'll commit to addressing that later. Just one more day of doubting before I ask someone to walk with me. Just one more day before I take my responsibilities seriously. Small moment by small moment, our decisions accumulate until they build habits that are incredibly difficult to break. Like a wagon wheel stuck in that deep rut, we built for ourselves deep ruts in our responses to life, to these things over and over again. The longer we put it off, the harder it becomes. We're all too aware of the danger of the littles in our lives. And maybe this is something we can take time to talk about with our friends over lunch, or consider it with your spouse this afternoon, or with some friends as you consider, just this message. I think there's also an important part of procrastination that we need to address. It's sort of a cousin of procrastination that isn't readily apparent at first glance. There isn't a noticeable absence of activity in this area, but actually the opposite. It's a flurry of activity, right? It's the busy, lazy person. I'm busy doing stuff. I'm getting things done. We're consumed with a bunch of things that may not be inherently wrong, but missing the most important point, or missing the most important one. Everything except the very thing I know I need to be doing, I'm doing. For some of us, our laziness or our procrastination in this way isn't obvious, but it sits immediately behind a veneer of activity. It's appearance of making progress. Maybe we are in other things, but again, anything but the very thing that's needed is getting done. Okay, so sluggard runs to sleep. He resists with procrastination. Number 3, the sluggard refuses to finish. Refuses to finish. Proverbs 12:27 says, "Whoever is slothful will not roast his gain, but the diligent man will get precious wealth." What a humorous picture. The sluggard gets out there. He even shoots the thing. He's hunting. He may even kill the game, and he maybe even brings it back home, but for whatever reason, it just sits there. All this potential just sitting there and rotting. He doesn't finish the job. The game is left sitting unroasted, and he and his family, as Proverbs shows us, has nothing to eat. Now again, that may sound incredibly ridiculous. Who would do such a thing? But again, we're employing satire, humorous exaggeration. The Proverbs are using this humor exaggerated to make a point. The point is that the life of the lazy person is filled with starts and rarely sees finishes. The idea of finishing something is just exhausting. What seemed like a good idea at first gets crowded out when it comes to getting it gets messy and gets busy with the hard work of it. It's a pattern of failed finishes, habits of beginning things but never seeing it through because of the effort required to finish. Solomon again uses this in a humorous way. In 26 verse 15, he says, "The sluggard buries his hand in the dish, but it wears him out to bring it back to his mouth." He's found like this. He's hungry, but this is too exhausting to bring it back to my mouth. How much game have we killed but not received the nourishment of its food? How many dishes have we put our hands in but never followed through with the task? Maybe it's the projects we started at work with enthusiasm only to never see it to the end and see the benefit of it to others. Maybe it's the conversations we promised to many people that we would have, but actually never followed through. That was super convicting to me. How many times did we commit to meeting up with that friend or prayer for encouragement, but as time passed, it just got too hard to fit it in? I don't know. I'll get around to it eventually. How many tasks sit unfinished at home? So the sluggard refuses to finish. So we have the sluggard runs to sleep. He resists with procrastination. He refuses to finish. And fourthly, the sluggard is relentless in excuses. He's relentless in excuses. Proverbs 26:13 says, the sluggard says, "There's a lion in the road. There's a lion in the streets. A lion is out there. I'm going to be killed from it." Again, picking up that tool of exaggeration, the sluggard is here depicted making extreme excuses for the lack of responsibility. I can't go out there. I can't get that thing done. I'm going to get killed. There's a lion out there. There's no lion. What are you talking about? There's no lion. Get out there. It's kind of like the mowing the grass during the summertime. Go mow the lawn. I need to go mow the lawn. Go mow the lawn. It's too hot. Right, it's summer. Yeah, get out there and get at it. Mow the lawn. The point of the proverb is that the sluggard is ingenious in coming up with excuses on why he or she doesn't need to actually get that thing done. Never lacking for excuses, even ridiculous ones, he will employ them to keep from activity and keep from responsibilities. Now, again, before we just cast that aside as like we would never say something like that or never make such a ridiculous excuse, just think for a moment how easy it is to come up with these excuses to self-justify ourselves. I confess that as try as I might, in this particular season of life, I find countless excuses to not get up in the morning and exercise. It's just where I'm at right now, to be honest. Whether I went to bed late or the kids were up in the night, I have to work on this project in the morning, and you write that one more email before work tomorrow. I got to make breakfast for the kids or something. I got to meet that person for breakfast. It's too cold. It's too hot. It's raining. I just don't feel like it today, is the end of it. There's a line in the street. There's a line in the street. Or how about friendships? I'm talking about true, real friendships in the church, not the acquaintances at church and at work that you only know by name. I'm talking about the ones that take commitment, that take work, that take energy, the ones that require you to sacrifice and be there for a friend, the ones that require you to be a friend in order to have a friend, the kind of relationships that you are known and you confess sin and you meet up and you read the Word together and you pray, the kind of relationships that you need in order to give and receive gospel grace in times of trials and suffering, times of sin and doubting, times of joys. Those friendships, yes, are rare, and they also take effort. They also take exertion. Like a good marriage, you don't just drift to an excellent friendship. It takes work. Listen, I know there are discouragements about seeking friends. It's hard to find a friend, especially in this area, that will stick with you. And we sin against each other. We say things we shouldn't say. We do things we shouldn't do. And I'm not discounting that. But what I am saying is, are there excuses we are making to prevent us from putting effort forth in this particular area of friendship that we know we need? Never mind anyone else for a moment. Are there excuses inside of us that are keeping us from reaping the harvest of true friendships? I don't have time. Work's just too much right now. Maybe when it calms down. I'm not extroverted. I'm not good at conversation, and much, much more. Again, there's much more to hear to say, but just to consider, maybe there's a lion in the street there. The sluggard runs to his sleep. He resists with procrastination. He refuses to finish. He's relentless in excuses. And lastly, the sluggard rationalizes his deception. He rationalizes his deception. Proverbs 26:16 says, "The sluggard is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly." He is wiser in his own eyes than 7 men who can answer sensibly. Now, this by far is probably the scariest and most deadly aspect about the sluggard in the book of Proverbs. Solomon gives us all these characteristics of the sluggard, and he ends by telling us that the sluggard can pretty much excuse and convince himself of what he's doing is right. There's a certain level of blindness. He loves his rest, and he rationalizes it as a need. He convinces himself and others around him that his choices of doing or not doing one thing and procrastination of doing this other thing are justified and correct. Because he makes a habit out of always making the soft choice, he can convince himself that that project he started wasn't worth finishing anyway. It's not worth my time. Didn't want to finish it. The most importantly of all, he can start to believe his own extreme excuses as he rationalizes his inactivity away. This is what's deadly about the sluggard. Well, there you have it. There's certainly more we can say. There's 5 characteristics of the sluggard to answer the question, how did we get to this level of destruction and poverty? The sluggard runs to his sleep. He resists with procrastination. He refuses to finish. He is relentless in his excuses. He rationalizes his deception. Those are all the ways, the path, and the road toward destruction. What then should we do? What's the response? How should we respond to this? Well, point 3, there's hope. There is hope for the sluggard. What hope is there? Up until now, what we've wanted to do is consider thoughtfully the tendency towards laziness in our hearts. What I hoped to capture for you for us is a picture of our own lives in which we aren't all that different from the sluggard in Proverbs. It may not look like physical, literal poverty, but deep within us sits a heart that is prone to laziness. Deep within us is a heart that is prone to the sluggard. And what should we do? What's this response here? First, I think first we should just recognize the wisdom offered here in this text. This is the text for this morning. First is the wisdom offered. Proverbs 1, it reminds us, if you recall, that wisdom is calling out in the streets. She's raising her voice. She's calling to those who will listen. She's saying, who will listen? Who will consider these things and learn? Who will turn from their ways and take instruction? So this text is not just a reprimand on us. It doesn't just point the finger at us, but it also provides a warning for us to look at and to heed. We are to look at this proverb like the writer did and see and consider, to look and to receive. We are to hear the warning of impending poverty and be moved by this gracious warning, to be woken up to it, to the reality of our small, seemingly insignificant accumulation of decisions. If we are to receive instruction, if we are to receive wisdom, if we must see the decaying and overgrown vineyard of the sluggard and take note that this is the end for me in the areas of those poverties, in the areas of that life that I'm prone toward and the temptation of laziness in my heart, we're to see that, and we're to receive that lesson. And remember, Proverbs shows us that the simple become wise when we heed the wisdom and we glean this instruction from God's word. It's a gift. It's the first thing in front of us this morning. We don't get smarter or more knowledge. We don't get more know-how or get another app to fix all of our to-do lists. We don't get more information to avoid life's sticky situations and to prevent a disaster. We get God through wisdom. We get God. Through God's wisdom, we are awakened to the reality that no matter how hard we try, no matter how hard we work, no matter how much effort we put forward in taking strides of diligence, we can't make it on our own. We all feel that in different ways. Through God's wisdom, we are awakened to the reality that there's a good and a perfect Creator God. This is wisdom to you. You get God. And we also get that the sluggard is in each one of us in some way, shape, or form, and that really our laziness is a result of sin in our hearts. But the good news is that despite those best efforts to fix us on our own, we are actually incapable. That's actually good news because God sent Jesus. See, the last thing I want for you this morning is to hear this, especially for the unbeliever. If you're here this morning and you say you've not placed your trust in Jesus, the last thing I want you to walk away from this text is thinking that if you just work harder, if you just do better, or you look out for the laziness in your own heart, that you'll be more diligent. Or that somehow Jesus is a magic key to unlock your potential productivity. That's not what this is saying. Diligence isn't even the target in Proverbs. It's not even the goal. Friends, Jesus is the target of this wisdom. Jesus is the target of the word. And when we submit ourselves to God's wisdom, we get him. The good news is that God didn't just leave us in our sin and idleness. He came and sent Jesus for us. John 9, verses 4 through 5, Jesus is saying, we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day, because night is coming. There's a night coming when no one can work. As long as I, Jesus, am in the world, I am the light of the world, Jesus says to you. See, through the Spirit, God shows us that where we're lazy, Jesus was active. When the disciples were sleeping, he was awake and praying with his Father in the night before he was crucified. When we hesitate and shirk responsibility, he drove forward and his face fixed towards the Father's plan for him. Where we procrastinate, he got to work. He didn't delay. He didn't push it off. He didn't push off the hard work of the cross or ask for an extension for the next week. Where we make excuses to avoid discomfort and hard work and would much rather sit in our comfort, he looked discomfort in the eye and took it head on, climbing the hill of Calvary, step by step, to his death. Where we don't follow through in our tasks, where we fail to complete things, he labored under the wrath of the Father, taking the full punishment for our sin all the way to the bitter end. He finished his task, and he said from the cross, it is finished. As a result of his completed work, God was pleased to raise him up from the dead, defeating all sin and death, including the sin of our laziness. And even now, he is working, upholding the universe by the power of his word and interceding for us to the Father on our behalf. He's worked and he is working. Jesus sweat and he bled for our laziness. He wasn't idle. He wasn't apathetic, like Dorothy Sayers said. He was diligent, and he was diligent for you and for me. I was helped this week by saying that Christ is the anti-sluggard. He's the opposite of the sluggard. He's the model that we look to. Church, we must not let this proverb shackle us to some sort of method of try harder. As believers, that's not what this is about. Listen, when we follow Jesus, we're going to have those moments and days of laziness that we just want to throw into the trash can. How did I get there? How did I end up here again? How did I just waste the next opportunity? How did I find myself in this mess? What happens in my marriage? How did that one friendship go wrong? How did I lose my job? How did I get that grade on that exam? How did I get here? When we're buried and overwhelmed by the million things we can't seem to get done, or the hundreds and hundreds of tasks that await us or that we have left unfinished, when we feel hopeless and buried, we must remember this very gospel that saved us. The good news that saved us is the very gospel that's saving us today. That Jesus doesn't leave us and his sheep alone to fend for themselves. That he calls you to do what he wants you to do. But when he calls you, he provides the grace and the means for you to be able to do it in the moment, to see it through to the end. He has given you his Spirit to help you and transform you by God's word and the Spirit's power into the image of Christ. God is after heart change in us, not diligence by itself. He's after heart change. In the moment of weakness, as we see Jesus in all of his perfection and diligence, as we remember each of his minutes were spent absolutely perfectly. And in humility, when we receive that forgiveness, we can step out in that confidence and faith that his promises will be fulfilled in us. And so the weak, which is all of us, me and you, we pray in that moment of temptation to laziness, or the moment of temptation to cast it aside or to shirk off the responsibility. We ask, we go to prayer, we say confidently, because of what God has done in us and the Spirit that's within us, God, help me. I need you. Lord, bring up fruit in my heart right now. I need to see it. I need to hear it. I can't put this off any longer. I need to get to work. I need to do this. Help me to trust your promises. See, the lazy, we have hope, because one day his promises will be fulfilled in the end, all the way. He will return, collecting the greater harvest. We pursue a harvest of productivity. He pursues the greater harvest, which is his children, his people, and he will bring each one of us into his final rest. But for now, we work with that hope in mind. We work because it is Christ that works in us to accomplish his purposes, in and through his kingdom. We work as Christians because with the gospel we see differently. We see differently because of his work in us. Paul reminds us in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 10, he says, "But by the grace of God I am what I am, and his grace toward me was not in vain. On the contrary, I worked harder than any of them, though it was not I, but the grace of God that is in me." That's why diligence isn't the goal. He's the goal. Seek first him. Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness. Diligence will be added unto you. And so when we do, he gives us new eyes to work. He gives us new eyes to see diligence that is needed. He gives us new eyes to see that it was work tending the garden of our relationships. He gives us new eyes to see our studies at school. He gives us new eyes to see our athletics and our gifts and our talents and our sports and our service to the church. He grants us new eyes to see our neediness for his word and for prayer and for growing in spiritual maturity. And a church with brothers and sisters that can help us along and point out our laziness. And it's with this new heart and new eyes that we see our desires start to change. That's how change happens. It transforms us by Jesus. No longer do I want my own comfort. No longer do we desire to avoid things. No longer do I make excuses for myself. But like Jesus, I set that aside. We want to work for him, and we want to work like him. He is our model. Look to Jesus in those moments of temptation. As a final word, may God help us as we do this together. May he wake us up to the wisdom that we need to hear, the wisdom that he has in his word for us. May he use the warning of the sluggard to penetrate deep into our hearts, showing us our idleness and the different ways in which this lands on you, and reminding us of the diligence of Christ for us. He was diligent for you. May we behold and consider and see and receive the instruction. And as Derek Kidner puts it, be wise and learn while there is still time. Know that the sluggard is no freak, but as often as not, an ordinary person who has made too many excuses, too many refusals, too many postponements. It has all been as imperceptible and as pleasant as falling asleep. Let's pray. Lord, the Proverbs can sting us sometimes, and we ask that you would use them to give us wisdom. May we see Jesus. May we behold Jesus this morning. May you give us eyes to see the wisdom that he has for us in your word. May you work and stir up the Spirit in our hearts to hear the word that we need to hear this morning in these ways. May we be diligent in the spheres of our lives, at work and at home and in our spiritual life, Lord. Give us the grace and the help we need to see. Give us the grace and the help that we need to obey. And give us the grace and the help we need for your glory. We ask these things because of your Son, Jesus. Amen.